Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So I have a few mini PC reviews coming out in the next few weeks. It's one of those things where the companies just seem to throw all of them at me at the same time. And so I'll try to spread them out across the next few weeks so that we're not just inundated with a bunch of mini PC reviews, but I am pretty excited about some of the models I'll be testing out. Now the first PC we're going to test in this whole batch is going to be this one here. It's called the MoreFine S500 Plus. It's a pretty decent PC. It has all the ports that I would expect to find. It's got a nice chunky feel to it. It reminds me a lot of the older Mac Minis. Now this one comes in several different models, and I got the middle tier model. It's the Ryzen 7 5700U. And so as always, we're going to try to run this thing through its paces. So we'll play a bunch of PC games, try out some retro emulation, and then also see how Linux gaming is too using Batocera. And so without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, inside the box you're going to get a power cord, an HDMI cable, as well as some screws for the SATA hard drive option, and then spacers if you want to use an external GPU. It also has a SATA connector cable, and then a very large power brick. This thing is 120 watts altogether. It looks like a laptop brick. And as I'll show later in the video, I think this power brick is a little bit of an overkill. It also has a VESA mount if you want to mount this onto a monitor. And just to give you a perspective on the size, look, the power brick is almost the exact same size as a PS Vita. It's really big. Okay, let's look at the mini PC itself now. And first impression, this thing's pretty shiny, but it does have a plastic film over it, so let's remove that first. And it turns out this makes it even shinier. I don't know why manufacturers make these shiny tops on devices, it's just going to attract fingerprints. In terms of I/O, on the front here we have a full USB Type-C, 2 USB 3.2 ports, a power button, as well as a CMOS reset. On each side there's going to be some vents for the fan, and then on the back we have the power input, 4 USB 2.0 ports, HDMI 2.0, DisplayPort 1.4, and then both single gigabit and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet connections, and of course a headphone jack as well. Overall, this thing is pretty sizable. It feels nice and hefty, mostly because of the heatsink as well as the aluminum shell. Now I just went over most of the ports and stuff, but let's talk about specs real quick too. Now like I mentioned, this has a Ryzen 7 5700U APU with integrated Radeon graphics, and in addition to the ports we just went over, it does have some good connectivity too, Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. Now this model has 512 gigs of internal storage, and it ships with Windows 10 Pro, but it also can run Linux too. Now these PCs are unfortunately not on Amazon, so you'll have to buy them directly from their website, and they have quite a few models actually available. We're going to be testing the middle tier model, and as you can see here, it is $769. You can get one with less storage for a little bit cheaper, but I think it's worth it to get the 512 gigs. And the company has also given me a discount code, which I'll put in the video description. Now I wish we were testing the high tier model. This one has a Ryzen 9 5900X CPU, and it has a bare bones option, which is the same price as the other one with RAM and storage. And if you do add RAM and storage, it goes up to about $900, so $130 difference here. But this model has a much better CPU and can also be clocked up to 45 and even 54 watts of TDP. And we'll talk more about that at the end of this video here. First, I'm curious to open this up and see what's going on inside. Now it's actually pretty easy to access this both from the bottom and the top. On the bottom you'll have to remove the rubber feet, but after that it's just 4 Phillips screws. And first thing I noticed about here on the bottom is that this little battery here is not secured in place. And so when I was moving the mini PC around, it was actually rattling a little bit. Let's take a look at the fan and the heatsink. This is actually pretty massive. I would say about half the weight comes from this alone. But probably the most exciting thing about the bottom here is that it has an additional M.2 slot. And while you could add additional storage right here, another thing you could do is actually hook up an external GPU. And the packaging comes with risers, so you'd have space for the cable as well. So if you're looking for a mini PC that's expandable in the future, this might be a good option. Now let's take off the top and see what other things we can access. And really up here is kind of your meat and potatoes. This is where you can access and upgrade the RAM, as well as the other M.2 and a SATA port. In terms of RAM, as you can see here, it does use name brand Crucial RAM, and it's running at 3200 megahertz. Here's a look at the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip here. And then finally, here is the M.2 storage. Now, XPG is not quite a household name, but I've heard of it before, and it is better than having just generic storage. Now the SATA cables you would use right here to connect to the board and then to a 2.5-inch hard drive. And there's a spot for it in the top of the lid here, so you would just secure it with some screws. And I do appreciate that this device has 3 different storage options. Now, before we close everything else up, I'm going to put some double-sided sticky tape here on the battery thing, just so it doesn't rattle as much anymore. It's kind of a pain that I have to do that in the first place, but at least it's easy to fix. So yeah, overall, no complaints about the design here. It is a little bit industrial looking, which is something I always kind of appreciate with mini PCs. Now let's look at sizing for a second, and as you can see, it doesn't line up perfectly with my typical standard of using Irish butter. But I would say it's about 3 Kerrygold sticks altogether. And I would say this is kind of a middle of the road size when it comes to mini PCs. Of course, you have the much smaller ones like the Chewy Lark box, and even the recent SER4, which I reviewed a couple weeks ago, it's quite a bit smaller too. But I would say the S500 Plus is quite a bit smaller than the Minis Forum TH50. And so it's not the largest mini PC I've ever reviewed, but it is quite sizable. Let's take a quick listen to the fan noise at 100% load. So it's not too bad. It is a little bit of a high-pitched whine, but I would say it's perfectly acceptable. Now let's take a look at how the device actually runs. So jumping into the system, it's going to be your typical Windows 10 Pro setup, and I've already gone ahead and installed all of my applications already. As you can see here, it is running that CPU like we mentioned before, 16 gigs of RAM, and Windows 10 Pro. Now, when running a torture test to see the max capacity here, I did find that it maxed out at 25 watts altogether. And that is the max configurable TDP for this chip. But surprisingly, it usually stayed below 23 watts altogether, even at 100% load. And I did go into the BIOS and find the system configuration, and there are options to max the TDP beyond 25 watts. But unfortunately, no matter what I tried, it didn't actually change anything altogether. As you can see here, I had the exact same TDP readouts using the same load. Now, running the APU tuning utility also wouldn't go beyond 25 watts, but surprisingly when that was running, I actually did get better power consumption up to 25 watts when running Prime 95. And so I think in terms of performance, your best bet here is to run the AMD APU tuning utility to get it up to that 25 watts, and then also go into the power options and set it to high performance mode. And unfortunately, that's about all you can do. You're going to be limited to 25 watts on this machine. But let's see how that actually performs in a real world setting. We'll start with PC gaming here, and as always, we'll do just one level of Celeste just to get me a little bit further in the game. It's running just fine here. Running Hades at 1080p here, I'm getting about 120 frames per second, so pretty good. Same thing with the Ryzen Chase, I was getting well over 200 frames per second. And I decided to test out the Battletoads game because it's on Game Pass, and it turns out this game is terrible, but hey, it runs at 60 frames, no problem. Moving over to Tunic, I did run this with low shadows and SSAO off, and I was getting a little bit over 30 frames per second at a 1080p resolution. The gameplay didn't slow down at all, but it wasn't as smooth as it could be at 60 watts. I decided to go with balanced graphics settings for Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and for the most part I got a solid 60 frames per second. It would dip down to maybe 59 during battle sequences, but otherwise it was great. Counter-Strike Go, I got over 100 frames per second, sometimes up to 115. So this one seems to be pretty good for competitive shooters like this. Moving up to some beefier games, here's Halo Master Chief Collection at the original settings. And I would get around 60 frames per second most of the time, but it would dip down to around 50 frames per second during busy battles. But I would say this is completely playable. In order to get a good frame rate with Street Fighter V, I had to turn it to medium settings, but it worked pretty well. And I also decided to test Doom Eternal, and I'm running at the recommended low graphics settings here. And overall, the gameplay was pretty smooth. It would dip between 45 and 60 frames per second, depending on what was happening on the screen. But overall, I would say it's completely playable and relatively smooth. I also tried playing the same game on Game Pass, and as you can see here, it's running at a 1080p, but you're getting a lot of graphical anomalies because of the streaming. And so honestly, I preferred the low resolution over this one just because it played a lot more smoothly. Part of that may be because I'm in Hawaii and we don't get really great connections out here, and so you might actually get better streaming quality on your end than mine. Okay, let's move over to emulation. We're going to start with Nintendo GameCube and just kind of run through all the Nintendo systems first. I'm going to run everything at a 3x resolution, so a 1080p here, and it's running pretty well for most games. Crash Nitro Kart is great. Same thing with the other games that I would consider to be on the low to medium tier, things like Mario Tennis or Mario Kart Double Dash. These ones ran just fine, no hint of slowdown or anything. Same thing with NBA Street. I think this is going to be pretty good for sports games. And surprisingly, even F-Zero GX played at full speed right out the box. Typically, right when you start out a match, there's a little bit of slowdown and then it catches up, but with this one it was full speed the entire time. So that's a really good indication that later on in this game you'll still get some really good speeds. The only game I really had some problems with was Beyond Good and Evil. This is one of the harder ones to emulate on the GameCube, and as you can see, it's struggling to meet 60 frames. Now, potentially you could use the PAL version here and then set it to 50 Hz, and that might give you a little bit smoother gameplay, but overall, I'm not really sure this one's ever going to play at full speed on this mini PC. But still, I found that the games that didn't play at full speed were few and far between. For the most part, I would say this is completely capable of both GameCube and Wii. Moving up to Wii U, we're going to start with the hard stuff first. Here's Breath of the Wild, and unfortunately it hovers around 25 frames per second the entire time. And what that means in the real world is that the gameplay is going to be just slightly slower than you may expect. And on top of that, every once in a while you will find some audio stuttering. So unfortunately not a perfect gameplay experience when it comes to Breath of the Wild. And unfortunately I had similar issues with Mario Kart 8. This is running at 720p resolution, but as you can see it struggles to even meet 50 frames per second. And so I think the Wii U games that are very easy to emulate, things like Super Mario Bros. U, this will be just fine, but most others will have some slowdown. You can see even here with Wind Waker HD, it doesn't quite reach 30 frames per second. Now I'd say this game is completely playable, but if you're trying to get the most perfect experience, then this may not be the PC for you. Okay, finally rounding out the Nintendo games, let's do Nintendo Switch next. Here is Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, and when using the Vulkan backend in the undocked mode, it actually ran at a smooth 59-60 frames per second. Same thing with Super Mario 3D World. This one also played really well. I think this is completely playable. I did experience some slowdown with the latest Kirby game here, and so this one's probably not up to snuff when it comes to playing this game. And I had the same experience with Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. Even with this 60 frames per second patch enabled, unfortunately this one just couldn't keep up. And so I think when it comes to Nintendo Switch, the performance is going to be hit or miss. Some of the more intensive 3D games like this one or Mario Odyssey aren't going to be perfect, but quite a few were surprisingly good. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 was actually relatively nice. And so while I wouldn't recommend this exclusively for Nintendo Switch emulation, it does a pretty handy job in certain games. Alright, let's move over to Sony next. We're going to do Sony PSP first. This is running at a 4x resolution, so 1080p altogether, and this was just great. I had zero issues with any game that I tested. But that being said, you could probably get a mini PC at half this price that's still also going to play PSP really well. In fact, you can get similar results with an Nvidia Shield TV. And so if you're trying to focus exclusively on PSP games, much like with Nintendo Switch, this probably isn't a perfect fit. But let's see what the S500 Plus can do when we give it a little bit harder of a system to use. So now let's move up to PS2, and surprisingly this one did better than I was expecting for this console in particular. For the most part, I would say 75% of the games that I booted up using this mini PC ran at 60 frames per second with no other tweaks required. And that's pretty good. You know, when it comes to PS2 emulation, I found that more often than not, you have to do a lot of tweaking to get these games to work properly. And the fact that you can play most of the catalog without having to mess with the settings is a good sign. In fact, the performance for some games are better on PS2 than they are on GameCube. Beyond Good and Evil had a couple frames per second better than the GameCube version, which is an indication to me that this is going to run PS2 pretty well. And I think the best indicator that this is going to be a capable PS2 emulation machine is the fact that Ratchet & Clank played at 60 frames with no other tweaks. And then same thing with the first God of War. This one ran really well right out of the box. Now, it's not all perfect. For example, Tekken 5 here, it did run at mostly 60 frames per second, but it would dip down to 55 here and there. And then of course God of War 2, which is always really hard to emulate, really kind of struggled here. It probably got around 54 frames per second on average. And that will result in some slowdown and audio stuttering too. But like I've recently found, the PS3 version of this game sometimes runs better, and in this case it does as well. In fact, the PS3 version looks a lot better than the PS2 one did upscaled, and so this is probably going to be a really nice fit. The frame rate does dip down to something like 45 frames per second here and there, but the gameplay actually stays relatively smooth. I don't know if this is just compensation within the PS3 build, but overall I would say this is a completely playable experience anyway. And I would kind of equate the PS3 performance to about the same equivalent as Nintendo Switch. Some of the games would play at 60 frames per second no problem, like Dead or Alive 5 here. And others would have some slowdown, but I would still consider them to be playable, like this Ratchet & Clank game. And Demon's Souls would hover between 28 and 30 frames altogether. This is probably one of those cases where you want a more solid 30 frames per second just based on the quick movements you have to make. So the frame rate's fine, but probably not playable in this context. And there were a few games that just were completely unplayable. Devil May Cry is a really good example here. It was getting sometimes like 12 frames per second, which is totally unacceptable. And so like the Switch, some are going to be hit or miss, and it's really going to be up to you to experiment and see which ones work best. But I'd be conservative in saying that maybe 50% of the catalog is going to play pretty well. Okay, finally let's move over to Xbox, and actually at a 1x resolution, most of these games played really well. I did try a few of them at a 2x resolution, and unfortunately it did create some slowdown, and so I think 1x resolution is just going to give you better performance altogether. But as you can see, the results speak for themselves. For the most part, I was getting a solid 60 frames per second in most of these games. And so if you have a real hankering for original Xbox content and you don't mind having it at the original resolution, this mini PC might fit that bill for you. Okay, so that's a wrap up of the Windows emulation. Let's actually move over to Batocera now. I'm going to plug in my Batocera flash drive and boot into this Linux-based operating system. And it booted up just fine, and as you can see here, I can navigate through all my game systems. And I really love the setup because all of the games and the emulators are all in a flash drive. And I'll leave a link to my tutorial in the video description. But let's jump into some games here and just test out the performance. As you can see here, Nintendo 64 is running great, and this is also upscaled at a 1080p resolution. But before I get too hot and heavy with some of those higher end systems, let's also check out the retro stuff too. Of course, these are going to play just fine on the Windows side as well, but my favorite thing about Batocera is that it's all self-contained within this one operating system. So you don't have to worry about having this alongside all of your other Windows apps. And as expected, performance for things like the original Nintendo, or Game Boy, or Super Nintendo, all these are going to be just fine. There's going to be no problems at all when it comes to emulating these systems. And this device is more than capable of doing high-end arcade emulation too. So as you can see here, Killer Instinct is playing without a hitch at all. And then starting to move up a little bit, you could play Sega Saturn upscaled to even 1080p and it's going to run super smooth too. And same thing with Dreamcast. So when it comes down to it, emulation all the way up through Gen 6 should be pretty good. And while I do think that some emulators are going to run better on the Windows side, I did want to test out some of those other Gen 6 consoles like GameCube. And as you can see, F-Zero GX is still running at 60 frames per second using the Vulkan backend. So again, I would say this is very capable of GameCube and Wii. Now PS2 is a different story. It doesn't have DirectX 11 on this end here, so you're going to get worse performance. And unfortunately, I've had some issues getting the Vulkan renderer to work properly. And unfortunately, as you can see, OpenGL is just kind of terrible. So PS2 is probably going to be somewhat compromised. But on the right side, Xbox seems to be just as good on the Linux side as it did on Windows. Overall, I was actually pretty surprised at how well Xbox did both on the Windows and Linux sides. Okay, so that's a good look at the performance now. Let's talk a little bit about what I like and what I don't like about this device, and whether or not I recommend it for you. In terms of what I like, I think it has a nice size and weight to it. It just feels like a solid computer. I really appreciate that it has two different M.2 slots as well as that SATA hard drive. It gives you a lot of options when it comes to storage. And like I mentioned, this is going to be a really friendly option for upscaling later on. If you wanted to add an external GPU, it's going to be really easy with this mini PC. I do like that on the higher end model, it has a bare bones option, so you can add your own stuff to it. And it's got a lot of good ports to it. 4 different USB 2.0 ports are going to be great for connecting up controllers. I also think this is going to be a really good device when it comes to streaming. A Wi-Fi 6 and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet are going to go a long way to keeping this thing future-proof. And as we saw, overall performance is actually pretty great. PC games ran at 1080p just fine. And then emulation all the way up through PS3 and Switch were impressive too. But as always, not every device is perfect. Let's talk about what I don't like about the S500 Plus. Number one, this model in particular is limited to just 25 watt TDP. And the thing is, if you pay $130 for the high-end tier of this device, you can actually configure the TDP in that one to 45 and even 54 watts altogether. And so when it comes to bang for your buck, you're actually going to get more performance for your money if you get that high tier model. I do think it's probably going to be worth that $130 difference. And one odd thing to me is that it shipped with a 120 watt power brick. Given the fact that the CPU doesn't go over 25 watts, it feels like overkill. And I wouldn't really mind other than the fact that the power brick is just kind of huge. It's like half the size of the PC altogether. And this is totally subjective and nitpicky, but I don't like having shiny tops to my mini PCs. I just feel like it turns into a fingerprint magnet at that point, and it just feels like you could do so many other cool design things at the top here. And finally, this is one of the more expensive mini PCs that I've reviewed on this channel, and $750 plus is quite a lot of money. And for that amount of money, you can actually get a fairly nice pre-built PC. Of course, the size is going to be much bigger than a mini PC, so you are paying for that premium small size. But at this premium price, I do think it's worth considering whether or not that's going to be worth it for you. And that's just talking about pre-built PCs. If you were going to build your own and potentially use some used parts as well, you can get a really capable PC for $750. Now, I'm not saying that the S500 Plus is not worth its price. In fact, you're getting a lot of stuff for that amount of money. But I do think that at this price point, it is worth considering a larger PC. And if you're going to spend $750 on a mini PC, I think it's worth considering that higher end model too. And I get it, it's $130 more, but I do think that that chipset as well as that configurable TDP is going to last you a much longer time. Anyway, that's about it for this video. If you are interested in checking out the S500 Plus, I'll leave a link for it in the video description below. And like I mentioned, the company did send me a voucher code to use if you'd like. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this something you're interested in picking up, or are some of the other models I've showed off on this channel a better deal? As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.